So I'm going to talk about something a bit different. So I'm not a cryptographer, first of all. So I'm probably not the one to ask about lattices and codes. But I do have an interest in digital money. And in particular, I have a group at UCL that is developing solutions for the future of money. So we have the Future of Money initiative, where we're working with our partners in industry and other universities around the world toward answering some fundamental questions about what money is for and how to enable transactions in the digital economy that look like transactions in the physical economy. Now, this is not a new question, but we do have some new approaches and insights that we've developed recently that we think you might find interesting as well. Now, I'm going to speak a bit about blockchains and DLT systems, although I want to emphasize that our approach to how we want to use those systems is perhaps a bit different than what you may have seen before. So I want you to think about, open your mind to different possibilities about what it is that we want to achieve and how we might achieve it. In that sense, I think, the fewer priors, the better. Think about what you want money to do for you, and think about what the digital economy has been. Now, I say partitioned digital asset infrastructure here because the salient part of this that I think we really need to focus upon is the idea that in order for transactions, retail transactions, which is to say individuals and businesses, in order for those kinds of transactions to work, we need them to work within an institutional context. And I say this because even though we might all love cryptocurrency, it is very difficult to go to a cafe and buy coffee with Bitcoin. Now, there might be various reasons for that. For example, the Bitcoin rails might be hard for coffee shops to use, and it might be the case that transaction fees are too high, et cetera, and maybe we can address it. But I'd like to focus a bit on what it will take for institutions to accept new kinds of ways of payment. What are their requirements? What do we really want? And I'm going to focus a bit on self-custody today, because self-custody is actually something that often gets lost in translation. We think about privacy, we think about zero knowledge transactions, all good. That's very important, close to my heart. But self-custody and questions about balances versus tokens and these kinds of infrastructural considerations are actually no less important. So today we'll talk a bit about those. Now, I'd like to first introduce this question about accounts. Now you may have discovered, you may have learned over the past few years that everything seems to be an account today, right? In order to do anything with the internet, and indeed anything with many businesses, you need to establish an account first. And there are economic reasons for that. But when I say that online really feels a lot like a line of credit, what I'd like you to think about is this idea of responsibility, right? And this idea of accountability. And you can't have an account without accountability, after all. That's what an account is. And it's an account, and specifically, it's an accountability from the account holder to the account provider. Okay? So there have been many articles. There was one very recently in the Jacobian about every business wanting to be a bank. Well, a bank in what sense? I spent some part of my life working in banking, and I can tell you, I thought that banking was something very different than what it is that they're trying to do. Banking is about taking deposits and making risky investments. That's banking. And the concept of banking here, or the concept of account provision, is really about facilitating transactions. It is sometimes about taking deposits, yes, but let's understand what's really going on here when you create an account. Now, you may have noticed that most modern digital payments, and I'm sorry about the title there. It seems to be blocked. But what this says is most modern digital payments are custodial. Now, this seems to be an artifact of how retail payments have developed over the past 50 years. Now, we have interbank transfers, we have card payments, interbank transfers using local gross settlement systems that are orchestrated by your local central bank. We have card payment networks, we have SWIFT, all of this predicated upon your money being sitting in a bank account that's operated by a regulated financial institution. That's digital payments today. Now, we know about physical payments that are non-custodial. You can have cash, you can have vouchers that are given to you by that coffee shop, and you can present them and get your coffee in exchange for them. But in the digital world, it seems to all be custodial. Now, that's no accident. All right? And this is about technology versus services. Now, it turns out that, now this doesn't work. It turns out that it's not a force of nature for these transactions. Thank you very much. It's not, yes, this works. Thank you. So it's not a requirement of nature that all transactions must involve money that's held in accounts. You can actually have digital cash, non-custodial cash. All right? But you'd be forgiven for thinking that digitalization is the same as accountification, because that's how the systems and institutions have evolved. So how do we get to here? That's the question. Digital and non-custodial. It is entirely possible to do this, but we have to think carefully about the business implications and the regulatory implications when we do. Now, I'd like to make an observation about privacy, since many people here are interested in this question of privacy and control. Now, many of the prevailing institutional efforts to develop digital currency that is useful for retail transactions, whether this is central bank digital currency or stable coins or other kinds of initiatives that call themselves digital currency, assume that money that's used in payments must be held in accounts with third-party custodians. They just assume it. They assume it by design. They say, oh, you know, it has to be this way. It couldn't be any other way. Now, if you ask me, I would say that this is a profound lack of imagination, but let's try to understand the implications of what that means. If you want the transaction to succeed, custodians need to share information at some level. Now, you can think about what that means intuitively, right? The recipient needs to tell the sender where to send the money. The sender needs to put the money somewhere and then tell the recipient where it is. You know, something like this needs to happen. Some information sharing needs to happen in the system in order for the transaction to succeed if it's going from one custodian to another. So that means that if you have a regulated custodian that's implementing some kind of KYC mechanism that knows who you are when it's maintaining an account at your behest, then that means that the transaction is linkable to you. And if successive custodians know the information that linked them to previous transactions in a chain, then basically you can get metadata leakage. You can watch all of the history of the transactions. You can see who has held the money. And that's what companies like Chainalysis do. And they make a lot of money doing it. And they can do it because if it's custodial, it's up for grabs. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that if you have third-party custody of your assets, you will not have privacy. It does not matter that you're using zero-knowledge transactions to get your payments done. If you have a custodian, you're done. So that's too bad. Now, If you look more carefully at the ECB's proposal for the single currency package, which entails the digital euro, as well as some protections for cash, which are welcome, they spend a lot of time focusing on this dual offline payment concept. I'm going to tell you that that's nonsense. Okay? Now, the motivation is good. Let's see, what can we do to enable transactions that are held inside, that are held by people directly, etc. Well, unfortunately, we know that fair exchange requires a mutually trusted third party. That is just true. And there is a paper by Pania and Gertner from about 26 years ago that has proven that this is true. Now, I know that some of you will probably say, hey, wait a minute, what about secure enclaves? What about quantum entanglement? What about software blobs that have that don't validate unless they have the right data and so on? Well, it's all a third party. And if it's a secure element or a secure enclave, it just happens to be a third party in your wallet. And this has a lot of problems. Now, the first problem I would say is security. If we want to use this at scale with something like a digital currency, like a stable coin or a CBDC, any sufficiently powerful actor of sufficient scale, think state actors, think organized crime organizations, they will be able to take control of that device. I promise. So this idea that we can trust this device is amateurish. And of course, there are the arguments about why these trusted devices aren't really yours, not really under your control. It's not open source. You can't make your own. The economic realities are always hew towards the people who manufacture the trusted chips. All of that stuff is true. But the one that I think of all of these, the one that I think is most compelling is the fact that it's still third-party custody. You're not in control of your own device, meaning you're not in control of what that device contains, meaning that it's really just a way of bringing that whole custody question into something that's inside the security envelope of a third-party custodian. So once again, it's not self-custody. You might think it's self-custody because you're carrying the device on your person, but it really is just an extension. Make no mistake, it is really just an extension of that account-based system that is operated by someone else. So what I'd like to suggest is it would have been better if the ECB in this proposal had focused on the possibility that you might hold money offline, but transact it online. And I say transact it online so that you don't need to rely upon secure elements or secure enclaves or shared code or some other kind of third-party facility that you carry with you. And yet, that wasn't part of the proposal. That's too bad. Now, you might ask, well, what about these proposals that involve zero-knowledge proofs that use balances, right? And there are some lovely proposals, well proven. You probably are thinking about them right now if you're cryptographers, right? Platypus, Peretti. These were nice, well-designed, thoughtful, proposed architectures, right? Transactions were in zero knowledge, revealed nothing. That's great. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that they basically maintain balance states, and you need to hold on to residual information about the state of your wallet effectively in order to do the next transaction. So we call that property transaction dependence, right? Which is to say that you need to be able to send proofs effectively that you are able to make this balance succeed if you want it to succeed, and that means that you need to have information. That means that you need to have information that is retained about the state of your balance that is historical. And the problem with that is that if you need to maintain this evidence to generate this kind of proof that you have enough funds to be able to make this payment, then that means that you could be blackmailed to provide that evidence on demand. Anything that can be proven, after all, can be forcibly discovered. If it can be proven by you, it can be gotten from you. So you want a way to eliminate the evidence. Sort of like the way that when I pay cash, that banknote is gone. It's gone. I have no record of it. Anyone can stop me and say, hey, did you make that transaction? You can say, I don't know. I have no way to prove it. But with this system, you do have a way to prove it. And that's a weakness. So what we really need is eCash tokens outside of accounts. eCash tokens outside of accounts. That's what we need. Now, this is not new. I'm not saying anything that hasn't been said many times over the last 45 years. So perhaps this is a bit strange for this dinosaur to come up and talk about dinosaurs. But actually, there's a lot that we can learn from what's gone on in recent years in this space. Now, my favorite example is this. Now, some of you may have seen over the past few weeks, even, this is in the zeitgeist, folks. There's this company called Kagi. Have you heard of this company? All right, let me tell you a little bit about Kagi. It's a company that's developed something that's a search engine, calls itself Premium Search. Okay? Premium Search. And how does it work? Well, it says, look, you know, when you do a search on Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo or any of these other systems, ultimately, you've got this problem that these kinds of companies will be inclined, for whatever reason, the companies that are doing the work to generate the information about the outputs are inclined to want to monetize this somehow. So that means that all else being equal, they'll want to serve you ads. They'll want to facilitate search engine optimization. Your results will not be what you want. And it's nothing like search 25 years ago. Okay? So nowadays, search is lots of ads, perhaps AI generated outputs. Google itself has moved on to answer engines to give you a sense of where they're going with this. Traditional search, who cares? What we want is to give you the answer so you don't even need to think about it. But that's not really what people want. If people want to explore a space and truly comprehend it, the answer engines are never going to be sufficient for that goal. Like, you might want search. So these guys, Kagi, said, okay, this is really bad. You don't want to be bombarded with ads. You don't want to have your data collected and used. So you have this idea of paying money. Oh my goodness, you're going to pay this company, Kagi, real money. I think $10 US a month was what they're charging for these things, right? If you want to do premium searches, you'll charge money, and people pay for this increasingly. This is interesting, folks. This is interesting. And my favorite part about it is not just that people pay for it, but that they say, look, we're acknowledging that the surveillance capitalism method for making money is not actually going to be sustainable. So we're going to integrate this with Privacy Pact, which is an elliptic curve-based cryptography system that has some weaknesses because you can't necessarily easily prove that it hasn't segmented you and all that. But look, this is a really good first step, because it shows that tokens to facilitate payments for actual transactions on the internet are taking off. All right? But this idea is not, why does this fail? Why does this fail? Oh dear. Why does this fail? This idea is not new. David Chown, 1981. Blind signatures for untraceable payments. All right, you've probably seen this before, you've thought about this before. You know, Alice generates a blank sheet of paper with a number on it, gets it signed blindly by this issuer. The blinding function, RSA, the blinding function commutes in the encryption function, so you can basically get a blinded token and unblind it by applying the inverse of the blinding factor. Fine. Okay. And then Alice can send a new fungible anonymous token to Bob, right? And then Bob returns the anonymous token to the issuer and says, hey, I've got one. Issuer says, hey, where did that come from? I don't know, but hey, I see a valid signature from me. I guess I will give you the money. Really great. I mean, really great. You know, this was really the first cryptocurrency, I would say, the first one I know about. Okay, based upon Shamir's work in a few years before that. And it's got some problems, though. Some problems that aren't problems with the cryptography, but they're problems with the system that surrounds it. The issuer is in the hot loop of the transaction, right? So this creates something of a race condition. What if Alice spends her token twice? Does only one of them get it? Does the issuer need to have a mutex? How does that work? You know, does the issuer need to maintain a database of the tokens that it received? Well, yes, it does. You know, can Bob tell Alice, hey, look, the issuer rejected it. Sorry, you know. I mean, there are lots of problems. And a big problem is that the issuer can equivocate about the transactions as well. The issuer can say, I don't believe that signature is valid. Well, wait, I can prove that it's valid. No. Someone sent it before. Well, who did? I don't know. I mean, this is this requires a lot of trust in this issuer. And that's part of the reason that this never scaled, I would say. Okay. It's not the only reason. Part of it was the time. Now, fast forward to 40 years later. So a group that I was involved in developed this proposal, and we wanted to make it institutional. That was our focus. You know, can digital currencies protect privacy and comply with regulations? Can we have some concept of a role for banks and institutions in this context so that we can get it to work, so that we can facilitate it? And let's remember, in the history of payments, why did Visa and MasterCard take off? Why are they, basically running the world of payments today, right? Why has MasterCard increased 100x? Its enterprise value has increased by a factor of 100 over the last 20 years, which is like 2 back-to-back unicorns without a tiny fraction of the risk. Why is that? Well, it's because they use the banks for distribution. They didn't require everyone to have a direct relationship with the card provider the way that American Express and Discover and Diners Club do. They use what we call a 4-point payment system involving banks for distribution. So we say, well, look, if we can do the same thing for channel payments, maybe we have a better shot. So Alice generates blinded token with Alice's bank as a facilitator or an issuer. I mean, it depends upon the design, and we have a few different proposals, but I'll abstract this away. And then Alice sends the anonymous token to Bob, but what we do is we require Alice to register a transfer commitment for this token. And this token isn't just some random number, but it's actually a structured data frame that contains some information that references some kind of relay, which is basically an integrity provider that is specified inside the token that allows Alice to commit a change, an update to the state of the relay, and then proof that this commitment had been registered is what she delivers along with the token to Bob's bank. And the best part is that this commitment to the relay doesn't have to reveal any information about the transaction at all. Not only can it be a hash, which reveals nothing actually, because there's no reference to Alice in it, but it's also something that can be aggregated. And that means that the proof can be aggregated in such a way that what the relay needs to record in terms of its history actually is quite small. So any entity that's both mutually trusted by Alice and Bob can potentially serve this function of a relay. It could be a bank, but it doesn't have to be. And the money can land directly into Bob's bank if regulators wanted to do so. And yeah, users can still have bank accounts, but the payments are unlinked. So this is one way of bringing an approach to bringing the channel work forward. And yes, this can be done with zero knowledge proofs as well as blind signatures. You might ask, well, what happens if Bob doesn't trust the relay? Alice has committed this thing to a relay, but Bob doesn't actually trust it. Well, whoever the issuer of the token is that matters, whether it's a CBDC or a stable coin or e-money or whatever, the relay can actually provide periodic commitments to whatever it is that that issuer is trusting. And when I say periodic, what gets committed is not every transaction, but only aggregates on a periodic basis. And the number of aggregates that you need to send is a function of the latency that you want in the transaction. If you're okay with coffee shop transactions, which might take 10 seconds, that's maybe 1,400, that's 14,400 a day. Sorry. It might take 6 seconds, it would be 14,400 a day, right? If you wanted, you know, half-second latency because you were using it for a metro system, like the Paris Metro or something, it might need to be a bit faster. But it's only hundreds of thousands of transactions a day, even in that case. And you can have arbitrary number of people doing the transactions because the ledger here grows at a fixed rate because it's not actually processing every transaction. There are no global mutexes and no requirements for data availability. And one thing that I'd like to say is that we can think of data availability today in this discussion the same way that we've thought about quality of service in internet design discussions 50 years ago. Because 50 years ago, when we talked about internet design, everyone was saying, hey, we need quality of service. You know, we need to know that that packet will get to its destination. We need to take it, we need to carry it, guaranteed every time. Yeah, okay. Too bad it's not economically viable. Yes. Sorry. All right, finish up. Okay. All right, that's fine. So, and yes, we can also use a DLT system to address the risk of relays equivocating, right? I mean, yes, we can use a DLT for this purpose, by the way, but this DLT grows at a fixed rate because the marginal cost of sending a transaction into DLT is actually zero. And this is really important. It's actually zero. The same way that sending a packet across an undersea cable has a marginal cost of zero. You think it might have a marginal cost that's greater than zero? Well, it's not. You can't even saturate those links that go under the ocean. You can't even saturate them. The peering points, all of the sum of the terrestrial links that connect to the peering points that connect to a sub-ocean cable can't even saturate it if you completely DOS the system, right? So there's no scarcity. There's no cost to the big tier 1 internet operators for a marginal transaction. So why should there be a marginal cost to the DLT? In other words, gas is silly. If your system has gas, I'm here to tell you it won't work. The approach to get the gas down close to zero is futile, perhaps. Maybe we should think about having it be zero, actually. Okay? Oh, and by the way, I also wanted to say, if your regulator says that you need to have the identity of the payee in the transaction for KYC reasons, you can do that without having the payer in it. And if you want consumer protections, you can achieve it that way. And that's the same as GNU Taylor or Project Tourbillon. Now, how do we use distributed ledgers? Well, we don't use DLT to manage tokens. We don't use it to execute code. We don't use it to store data. All of the data availability is strictly at the edge. And we definitely don't use it to defend against Sybil attacks since we imagine that there'll be a permission network for this purpose. And why do we say that? Well, it's the issuer who determines that. Now, what do we use the DLT for? Well, really, it's for externalizing commitments, which is to say it's to prevent the relays from equivocating. And you can deliver the proof of equivocation ex ante, which is to say I furnish to you the proof that I have that this has been committed to the ledger, or ex post, meaning you trusted this integrity provider, and now we have proof that the integrity provider has done the wrong thing, and now we won't trust them anymore. It can work either way, and with different speed trade-offs. And yes, zero marginal cost, ledger grows at a fixed rate. And yes, you can move if you care about it, you can move the asset between ledgers just by encoding in the updates to the asset, encoding the next subsequent ledger in the transaction. So there's a lot that we can do. There's a lot that we can do here. And I did want to say a few words about third-party custody, in case you care about some of the CBDC proposals that some central banks have been focusing upon. And and as you know, I've had a long and deep relationship with a number of central banks around the world on this over the years, and some of their proposals have this idea of holding limits, which I think is kind of bunk, because if you wanted, as a justification for managing your account, it doesn't make sense, because you can actually impose a combination of withdrawal limits and token expiry, can do everything that holding limits can do without requiring anyone to manage your wallet. And this idea of wallets being just another word for account, that's part of the problem. Wallet service provider. What does that even mean? I mean, this wallet, which is a money clip, I mean, it was created by someone, but there's no service. I have no relationship to the company. I'm not even sure I know what that company is. In fact, I don't even know that that company still exists. Also, this idea of identifying payers in transactions seems to keep coming up, because the FATF travel rule, and the FATF has been concerned about non-custodial wallets and has published it in their guidance and so on. Well, this concept was created 30 years ago or so, when most retail payments, use cash, really, and really the rules about banks were about keeping custodians from misbehaving, and you could argue maybe about geopolitical things, but really it wasn't about tracking every transaction. But suddenly it's shifted somewhere along the line. But actually, if you want to enforce your tax and sanctions and anti-fraud requirements, you can do this just by making sure that no one who gets the money doesn't satisfy those requirements, and that every arm's length transaction must satisfy these regulatory objectives. And yeah, you can prevent abuse by embedding requirements in the transaction channel, and you can provide these consumer protections. And this is what really gets me: this idea that consumers are, they need a paternalistic kind of system to protect them in the event that they want to unwind a transaction. Well, you can do that with insurance, and you can do that with service providers on the edge if you really must, including custodians, without requiring it of everyone. And you can enable abuse reporting to take up lost and stolen tokens as well. But what we have chosen to do instead so far is to actually deputize banks to shake down merchants in lieu of police. I mean, this sounds almost like a kind of a criminal network, doesn't it? It's interesting. But that's what we've got. So I wanted to just say a few words about what this is really about, right? At some level, banks and their accounts, are not really banking. When we talk about accounts and we talk about the accountification of everything, we're talking about, facilitating payments or facilitating transactions. We're not talking about banking. Banking is about taking deposits and making risky investments. It's about risk transformation. I love risk transformation. I worked for a bank for a long time. I appreciate that. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about payment service provision. And that actually is not banking. So we can separate these functions. And we should separate these functions. And key to that is to understand that this is really a telecoms problem. That banks have a role in payments because of the use of accounts. Okay, so it's historical, yes. It's path dependent, indeed. But digital currency actually allows us to have digital money outside accounts, which is what digital currency is for. No more and no less, I would say. Holding money outside of accounts. So when we create wallet service providers, I'm very confused. What's the point of this? Now you could say, hey, look, I want a different kind of system outside of the institutional control and all of that. Well, okay. I mean, there will always be outside transactions, but that's not what we're going to need to scale and to make this be a general solution. But what I can say here is this: we can still involve banks and payment service providers in these transactions. The roles in this kind of future system, operating the elements of this system, the issuance, the redemption, the registration, the integrity provision, all of these kinds of functions can be remunerated for a fee. But they don't necessitate custody in order to work. So when someone is brave enough to take this first step to facilitate payments this way rather than via custody, things will change. And we see evidence that things are already starting to change in the online services provision. So maybe we'll start to see the digital economy move in this direction. So I close with this UCL Future of Money initiative. We are developing both technology and business solutions in this space. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I will make the slides available to you if you send me email. Request them. And I've got some papers. We've got some papers on this as well. And if we want to talk about the details of the of how this works and how our model works, I have some extra slides on that just in case, but they are not part of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Let's take some questions.
Hi. It's an extremely clever and an amazing presentation. First of all, I really appreciate it, and I got so many questions. So I'm going to keep it simple. We'll always talk about money and transactions and currency, right? But this also applies to our own information and data. And we're talking about today how our own information is being sold and all that, and yet our own computers and phones do the same thing, where essentially these are also wallets that are handled by these companies and selling off so it's the same thing. So we can also apply this to not only just currency but also our own data. And my question to you is, and I fully support everything you just said, but the war is going to be against then the current institutions and the current governments who love this kind of big brother thing where they want to control everyone in every aspect, the money, but also especially the data and our own privacy. So how would we then have credibility in all this if the governments are quite, I would assume, are going to be against this way of going, because it gives them less power.
Thank you very much for that question. I think it's really interesting. So can I ask what when you talk about governments, what governments are you talking about?
I'm saying more in general, where you have more so like how every government has information on their civilians and people that live inside, and how it's a tough question to ask.
All right, so thank you. Well, thank you very much. I guess part of the question about specific governments, the reason that I focus on this is this government actually acting in the interests of its people or not? Right now, I like to believe that I like to believe that in most countries in Europe and America, we have governments that try more or less to act in the interests of their people. Right now, maybe that's naive. I wouldn't be surprised if you tell me, "Oh, that's crazy. The government is always pushing us down." Well, I'm not going to make that statement because I believe still, perhaps because I'm a dinosaur, I believe that governments are us and ways of solving collective action problems for us. And I believe that we do have a chance of convincing our regulators and authorities to actually serve our interests in this space, because this is a collective action problem. And our interests, let's be clear, are not actually against the interests of the government, even in collecting some data about us, like, for example, the data that underpin KYC. That's not what I'm not saying we shouldn't have KYC in the world. What I'm saying is that payers should be unlinked from the transactions they make. That's a more narrow statement. Okay? And the question is really whether governments want to orchestrate a system in which the information that links every payer to every transaction that they've made is something that is necessary for the ongoing survival of these countries and their civilizations. Right? And I think the answer is no. Okay, now that might require these governments to take some kind of a step against the business interests that want to conduct profiling on this basis. But that is something that we need to orchestrate, right? And that's something that we need to be politically involved to understand what's going on. This idea of profiling people is useful to businesses because that enables them to capture more consumer surplus. That's what that's about. Now, we may be experiencing, and Kagi, I think, is an interesting case because we may be experiencing the end to the assumption that the surveillance capitalism markets will grow forever at a rate that's greater than the cost of capital for other kinds of equity investments, right? We're discovering that, and it's going to be painful to unwind all of that investment that we've made in these companies that have an irrationally high multiple. And I worry about the pension funds and institutional investors who have made such investments. But that's a different kind of question than the question of whether this is actually necessary for security of a government or a national security consideration. And why do I say this? We can actually impose very strong restrictions on whoever receives money in this kind of system. So aside from the phishing expeditions that can be done by profiling people, which by the way aren't particularly interesting to governments most of the time, but are interesting to the businesses that operate these systems, the real question that we have to ask governments is whether they want to depend upon subsidy from these big platform companies operating infrastructure at low cost because they're harvesting data. And I think about this coming from the UK, where we've just signed this great deal with Palantir to run our National Health Services infrastructure, which is really bad. But I worry about this as being a fingerprint for future kinds of, a blueprint rather, for future kinds of transactions around the world. And it's that we need to, where we need to really pointedly get our governments to do something different. And I'm glad cryptocurrencies exist because it shows that there's a check on these systems ultimately. We will make outside solutions if this fails, but I'm not ready to give this up yet. I hope that answers your question.
Question.
Yep.
Love your beamer. I guess a very narrow question. I love the political and wide-ranging discussion of this talk, but maybe let's focus on the offline payments because I think this is kind of an important problem that we want to solve in practice sometimes. Like if I'm on an airplane, if I don't have an internet connection, I need this, right? Like this is a payment problem that I need to solve somehow, right? Or if the internet connectivity fails at the coffee shop, I cannot go out of business. So can we have a solution where the two parties maybe use a trusted hardware for that particular transaction, and then the rest of the system doesn't need that?
So thank you for that. So I have a few answers to that question. I mean, my first answer is this solution works for all of the cases you've described, right? It's really great. We think it's low tech. It ain't. All right. This works really, really well in coffee shops that have no internet connection. Very robust. It works even during big outages like we saw in Spain a few months ago. Works well for that. Works well in crises. Works well during floods and war and all of that stuff, right? Okay. And what about that train that goes under the Alps and doesn't have internet connectivity? Well, first of all, I have to say, if you're in an airplane, you do get internet connectivity because they have satellite links. So I'm not actually worried about that. But I am worried about the train in the Alps, right? And they haven't put in the 5G towers in the tunnels yet. Let's assume. Well, that's a very narrow case, and I've heard that case mentioned by colleagues at big payment networks as the primary justification for offline transactions. And I have to say that's a very vanishingly small part of the economy. So if this doesn't work in that, well, we've got a problem. But the other answer to your question is yes, frankly. If two people do believe that they want to trust some hardware, go nuts. Yeah, you can trust the hardware. I'm just saying, if you do it at the system level, it's going to be hacked. So if it's local, okay. If it's done at the system level, not so great. I hope that answers your question.